Louisiana horror. Father kills 8 children in Shreveport mass shooting. Police say a devastating mass shooting in Shreveport has left the community in shock after a father allegedly killed 7 of his own children and another unrelated child during what police described as a domestic violence incident. Now we take a deeper look and break down this entire story on the AI
If the
podcast.
city wants to stop a mass casualty event, the absolute worst place to put a metal detector might actually be the front door of a local school.
Yeah.
Or, a shopping mall.
Right, yeah.
Because statistically speaking, the most dangerous threat to a community already has the keys to your house.
Exactly.
And, you sitting there listening right now, you probably picture mass violence as this very public, totally random act perpetrated by a stranger. But the source material we are examining today, it entirely shatters that assumption. We're looking at a sequence of events out of Shreveport, Louisiana, that forces this terrifying recalculation of where public safety actually begins.
Yeah, the material in front of us really requires us to confront a fundamental vulnerability in how society categorizes danger. Like if we build these massive, expensive public infrastructures to protect ourselves from external threats.
Right, the metal detectors, the cameras.
Exactly. While the most statistically likely violence, it incubates in the one place we are biologically wired to let our guard down, which is the private home.
It's heavy. And I want to take a moment right at the top of this deep dive to just acknowledge the tone of the report we're digging into today.
Yeah, Tuesday.
Because we are looking at a single devastating news report detailing a mass casualty event in Shreveport. And it is profoundly heavy. The human cost here is just tragic.
It really is.
So for you, the listener, we are setting aside our usual witty banter today. We're replacing it with earnest, really respectful analysis.
Yeah, the subject matter completely demands a different approach.
Exactly. But I want to be clear, our commitment to bringing you, clear, thoroughly synthesized insights, that remains exactly the same. Our mission today is to look beyond the shocking headlines to truly understand the timeline, the staggering human impact, and, well, the systemic mechanics of domestic violence that our source material forces into the national spotlight.
Right, because analyzing a tragedy of this magnitude, it requires moving past that initial paralysis of shock. To understand how a community fractures under this kind of weight, we have to meticulously break down the logistical and psychological mechanics of the event. We must examine the specific data points the authorities have provided, not just to recount what happened, but to uncover the underlying why and how that can actually inform future prevention.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to comprehend the scale of the Shreveport tragedy, we first have to chronologically reconstruct the chaotic timeline that's detailed in this report.
Yeah, the timeline is crucial here.
It really is, because the violence didn't spontaneously generate inside the living room. It actually moved from the street into the residence.
Right.
According to the police, this began early Sunday morning, around 5 a.m. local time. And the suspect, who they identified as Shamar Elkins, he initiated the violence by shooting a woman on the street nearby before he even crossed the threshold of the home.
That's a huge detail.
It is. And my instinct, looking at that sequence, says this street shooting was entirely cold-blooded premeditation. It looks like he was intentionally clearing the board, removing a potential witness or obstacle before actually breaching the house. Or does it paint a picture of an escalating situation just spiraling entirely out of control? I see it almost like a cascading system failure.
A cascading system failure is a good way to put it, actually. But it is incredibly tempting to assign a tactical master plan to an event like this, right?
Sure, because it makes sense.
Exactly. But behavioral analysts who evaluate spatial violence, they view that transition quite differently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because a street is an open, uncontained environment. It introduces unpredictable variables, passing cars, neighbors looking out windows.
I mean, lighting, yeah.
Right. When Elkins moved the violence from the street into the home, it points less to a calculated clearing of witnesses and more to a terrifying loss of containment, followed by this desperate need to control the environment.
So dragging it inside changes everything.
It radically alters the physics of the situation. By dragging an open confrontation into a confined, enclosed space, he took control of the exits. He essentially transformed a public disturbance into an isolated siege.
Wow. And that transition from public to private space, it makes the time frame we are looking at even more harrowing. Because the report states the first shots on the street happened at 5 a.m., but police didn't discover the scene inside the home until shortly before 6 a.m.
Yeah, that hour it's an entire hour of uncontained violence just happening in the dark.
It's devastating. You know, in trauma medicine, there is a concept known as the golden hour.
Right, I've heard of that.
It's the crucial 60-minute window following a traumatic injury where prompt medical treatment has the highest likelihood of preventing irreversible shock and death.
Wow.
And when we look at the timeline from 5 a.m. to the police arriving shortly before 6 a.m., we realize that the entire golden hour for these victims was consumed by the event itself.
Yeah, that's awful. Because the violence had been relocated from a visible street into an opaque, locked residence, emergency responders were essentially blinded. The clock ran out before the scene was even secured.
Which makes the survival stories that are detailed in the report almost incomprehensible to me.
Truly.
Amidst that lost hour, the report notes that a 9th child in the home managed to escape by actually jumping from the roof of the house and surviving.
It's incredible.
And another victim somehow managed to sprint to a nearby house to call the police. I mean, the physical resilience is stunning, but the psychological burden placed on those survivors in that moment is what really stops me.
Absolutely.
Because the home is supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary. And to survive, these individuals had to consciously recognize that their sanctuary had become a lethal trap.
Yeah, they had to realize the threat was inside.
Right. They had to literally hurl themselves out of their private sphere and back into the public world just to summon help.
The cognitive dissonance required to make that split-second calculation is staggering. I mean, a child jumping from a roof in the dark is overriding every foundational instinct they have about safety.
Definitely.
Furthermore, the fact that a victim had to run to a neighboring house to physically access emergency services, it underscores the total informational blackout that occurred once the violence moved indoors.
Because nobody outside knew what was happening.
Exactly. The walls of that house acted as an acoustic and communicative barrier. It delayed the police response and isolated the victims completely from the outside world.
And that isolation, it directly leads us to the heartbreaking human cost discovered inside that home once the police finally breached the doors.
The toll is just...
It's beyond belief. The sheer chaos of that 1-hour window resulted in a devastating toll. We are talking about 8 children killed. 8.
Yeah.
And the source notes, they ranged in age from just 1-year-old to 14 years old.
The demographic reality of that victim profile introduces a very specific mechanical horror to the event.
What do you mean?
Well, we were discussing pediatric victims who physically lacked the motor skills, the bodily strength, or the spatial awareness to evade an adult attacker in an enclosed floor plan.
Oh, I see.
A 1-year-old and a 14-year-old present entirely different survival capabilities, right? Yet both are completely reliant on the adults in the home to maintain the physical security of their environment.
Right, they can't defend themselves.
Exactly. When the primary threat originates from within that environment, their agency is reduced to absolute zero.
And the report explicitly details the relationships here, noting that 7 of those deceased children were Elkins' own, while the 8th child was completely unrelated to him.
Which is such a tragic detail.
It is. Additionally, 2 adult women were critically injured, with one believed to be the mother of several of the children. And, the chaos did not terminate at the property line.
Far from it.
Elkins stole a vehicle, fled the scene, and crossed parish lines into nearby Bossier Parish. He was ultimately killed after police opened fire during a high-speed chase. Now, the investigators noted in their initial press conference that they believe he, quote, acted alone. And I have to push back on how law enforcement uses that phrase here.
Okay, how so?
Because I look at the sheer logistical footprint of this morning. You have an unrelated child caught in the crossfire, like the blast radius of a localized explosion, The shrapnel hit an unrelated child and 2 women.
That's a very visceral analogy, but it's accurate.
And then you have this massive high-speed police chase spilling into a completely different jurisdiction. How does the label of an isolated incident hold up when a multi-parish small army is required to bring the threat to an end? Even if he pulled the trigger alone, doesn't all this external chaos complicate that?
What's fascinating here is how the legal and public relations definition of isolated fundamentally contradicts the logistical reality on the ground.
Right.
When law enforcement announces that a suspect acted alone, they are employing a specific communication strategy designed for public pacification.
They want to calm everyone down.
Exactly. They're attempting to rapidly defuse community panic by ruling out, say, an active terrorist cell or a coordinated gang war.
Okay, that makes sense.
They are speaking strictly to the initiation of the crime. But your observation about the logistical footprint is completely accurate regarding the conclusion of the crime.
Because the moment he steals a car and flees, the violence becomes communal.
It becomes a massive civic stress test. I mean, a multi-jurisdictional pursuit is a logistical nightmare.
I can't even imagine.
It requires disparate dispatch centers in Shreveport and Bossier Parish to suddenly merge their radio communications in real time. It requires the Louisiana State Police to intercede, redirecting civilian traffic and securing intersections across parish lines to prevent collateral vehicular deaths.
Wow, yeah.
So while the tragic catalyst may have been a singular domestic act, the neutralization of that threat required a sprawling, incredibly dangerous mobilization of state resources. The fallout was anything but isolated.
And that gap between the internal family catalyst and the massive external police response forces us to pivot here. We really need to move from the timeline of what happened to the systemic why that was cited by the authorities in our source material.
Right, the categorization.
Exactly. The police formally and explicitly described this mass casualty event as a domestic violence incident.
And applying that specific legal and sociological categorization to a crime of this magnitude, it completely alters the analytical framework.
How so?
Well, it demands that we stop looking at this purely through the lens of random criminality and start examining the social fault lines within the community itself.
Yeah, and local leaders in Shreveport noted that a large share of violent crime in their city is directly connected to domestic disputes.
That's a known issue.
The text specifically states that this tragedy has, quote, intensified concerns over family violence. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. I want to challenge how society compartmentalizes violence. When we hear the phrase mass shooting, our collective mental firewall immediately pictures a random anomaly. We picture a disgruntled stranger walking into a movie theater or a mall.
Yes, exactly.
Why do we subconsciously separate mass shootings from domestic violence? How does framing this specifically as a domestic violence incident fundamentally change how a community prepares for and tries to prevent mass casualty events? Is it just a coping mechanism to make us feel like we can control our safety in public spaces?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that psychological separation is absolutely a societal defense mechanism.
I knew it.
Yeah, if we believe mass shootings are random acts committed by strangers in public squares, then we can buy the illusion of control. We can avoid certain neighborhoods at night, or we can demand our local government install metal detectors and security cameras at the mall.
Right, we can fix it with stuff.
Exactly. We place the burden of our safety on physical infrastructure. But acknowledging that domestic violence can escalate into a mass casualty event shatters that illusion of control.
Because it's happening inside.
It forces us to realize that the most lethal threats often bypass all of our public security measures because they have a legitimate right to be inside the sanctuary.
They don't need to sneak past a security guard because they live in the master bedroom.
Which means the traditional tools of community defense are functionally useless here. A community cannot arrest its way out of an epidemic that ferments behind closed curtains.
Wow, yeah.
Framing this specifically as a domestic violence issue means a city has to pivot its resources from physical infrastructure to social infrastructure.
That's a huge shift.
It is. The frontline defense is no longer a police patrol car. It becomes a well-funded domestic abuse hotline. It becomes family intervention counseling, early childhood education on emotional regulation, and providing immediate, no-questions-asked safe housing for partners attempting to extract themselves and their children from escalating coercive control.
That requires an entirely different municipal budget.
Completely.
It proves that private disputes are directly, mathematically feeding into the city's major public crime statistics. The line between what happens at the dinner table and what happens on the evening news is completely eradicated.
And the local leaders in Shreveport are being forced to acknowledge that exact eradication. You cannot compartmentalize family violence as a secondary polite issue to be handled in family court when it possesses the explosive potential to require a multi-agency state police response and generate a mass casualty scene.
It's all connected.
The private health of a family unit and the public safety of the city are inextricably linked.
And that linkage perfectly explains the profound alarm we are seeing from state and local officials. They aren't just reacting with predictable grief. There's a severe, almost existential panic regarding their overall city statistics and their national optics.
Let's talk about that ripple effect.
Let's examine it. Mayor Tom Arsenault called it one of the, quote, darkest moments in city history. noting that an event like this doesn't just traumatize the immediate neighborhood, it inflicts a psychological wound on the entire community.
And a statement like that from a sitting mayor serves two purposes.
What are they?
Well, it validates the immense localized trauma, of course. But it also signals to state authorities that the municipal resources are overwhelmed and require external support.
Which is why we also see reactions from much higher political offices.
Right.
Governor Jeff Landry and House Speaker Mike Johnson both issued public statements offering their prayers and expressing how heartbroken they were. And be clear to you listening, the source material presents these statements purely as reflections of communal grief transcending all boundaries.
Yes, not as partisan policy stance.
Exactly, not partisan at all. But it raises a point about the mechanics of government. Like, why do figures at the highest level of state and federal government immediately weigh in on a localized city event?
It's a good question.
It's because an incident of this scale instantly triggers mechanisms for state emergency funding, and it places a local jurisdiction squarely into the crosshairs of national data tracking.
It catapults a local tragedy into the federal spotlight. When state and national politicians issue those statements, they are performing a necessary function of disaster management.
They have to show they're watching.
Right. They're acknowledging that the scale of the violence has breached the threshold of local containment. It signals that the state apparatus is monitoring the fileout, which is critical for authorizing overtime pay for state troopers, unlocking victim compensation funds, and managing the broader narrative of the state's public safety record.
And the narrative of that public safety record brings us to a detail in the report that completely stopped me in my tracks.
The homicide stats.
Yes. City Councilman Grayson Boucher made a striking statistical observation. He pointed out that Shreveport's overall homicide numbers for the year have sharply increased because of this single contained act.
It's a wild thing to think about.
It reminds me of like a localized earthquake or the grading curve in a relatively small classroom. When one student gets an absolute 0 on a massive final exam, the entire class average plummets overnight.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right. The rest of the students didn't suddenly forget the material, and the classroom didn't inherently become a worse place to learn, but the overall mathematical metric is permanently skewed by one extreme anomaly.
This raises an important question about the incredible burden placed on civic leadership in the aftermath of mass violence.
Yeah.
Because statistics are the currency of city management. It's how cities secure federal block grants, how they attract new corporate businesses, and how they objectively measure the effectiveness of their police deployments.
Right, the numbers matter.
They do. When you have an event that acts like that grading curve, inflating the annual homicide rate overnight, civic leaders are placed in a nearly impossible rhetorical position.
Because they have to manage the cold, hard data while still honoring the immense human loss.
Exactly.
If they dismiss the numbers, they look callous. If they panic over the numbers, they terrify their own citizens.
They have to thread an incredibly delicate needle. They must explain to the public and to potential investors looking at the city's data that a sharp statistical spike in homicides does not equate to a sudden breakdown in street-level safety.
They have to say, it's not the whole city.
Right. They have to contextualize the data, explaining that this massive jump occurred within the enclosed environment of a single residence, meaning the statistical risk to the average citizen walking to the grocery store remains unchanged. But simultaneously, they cannot appear to minimize the deaths of 8 children just to protect their civic PR.
And the national tracking only amplifies that pressure. The source material contextualizes this event nationally, describing it as one of the deadliest mass shootings in the United States since January 2024.
The Joliet comparison.
Right. For context, they are comparing it to the shootings in Joliet, Illinois, earlier this year, where another isolated domestic dispute violently spilled across multiple crime scenes, resulting in 8 fatalities. By drawing that comparison, the media and the national databases prominently link Shreveport to a broader, nationwide epidemic of violence.
The context shifts entirely.
The localized grief is crystallized into a permanent national data point.
It strips the event of its local nuance. It transforms a deeply personal, complex family trauma into a standardized metric for national violence tracking.
Which is so clinical.
It is. Shreveport becomes a dot on a federal map, ranked and sorted alongside cities dealing with entirely different profiles of crime.
And that transformation from a private living room to a dot on a national crime map brings us to the core of what we've uncovered today.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive?
It's a big question.
We so often consume news about crime as distant, abstract data points. We look at neighborhood statistics, we install alarm systems, and we feel insulated if we live in a supposedly safe zip code. But this comprehensive look at the Shreveport tragedy reveals a terrifying reality about human behavior.
Which is that sometimes the most dangerous environments are hidden entirely out of sight.
Operating behind locked doors and closed blinds. This source material completely challenges us to rethink the geography of public safety. Safety doesn't begin at the city limits, and it isn't guaranteed by the presence of a police cruiser on your street corner.
No, it isn't.
It begins in the foundation of our homes. It is determined by how robustly we support families in crisis and how effectively we intervene in the earliest stages of domestic coercion before it detonates into a multi-jurisdictional massacre.
The material demands a total reevaluation of our civic priorities.
Yeah.
We must stop viewing family violence as an embarrassing private issue relegated to the shadows and start recognizing it as the absolute bedrock of broader community stability. The math is undeniable.
Yeah.
If the private home isn't safe, the public square isn't safe.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today, building strictly on the details of this devastating Sunday morning.
Okay.
Think back to the very beginning of our timeline. Before the police arrived, before the high-speed chase, before the politicians issued their statements.
Right, in the dark.
Think about the child who survived by leaping off the roof of that house, and the other victim who navigated the dark at 5 a.m. to pound on a neighbor's door.
The courage that must have taken.
Consider the unimaginable split-second cognitive resilience and the raw, desperate survival instincts demanded of those kids in the middle of a waking nightmare. As the police investigation eventually closes and the city's statistics are inevitably recalibrated, a massive question remains. The lingering issue isn't just about how a community polices the mechanics of domestic violence. The real enduring challenge is how society can possibly build a framework to support, protect, and genuinely heal the profound psychological trauma of the children who had to break out of their own home.
Okay, one question for you. How did a domestic disturbance escalate into one of the deadliest family mass shootings in recent US history? And were there previous reports, threats, or warning signs that authorities could have acted on earlier? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.